Hello dear children, I hope all of you are doing good, and today I am here with the fifth video of the video series on how do organisms reproduce class 10th science. And our today's agenda is to learn about the structure of a flower, pollination, fertilization and seed germination. So basically we are going to learn about the entire process of sexual reproduction in plants. Now trust me guys, this is a topic which is very important, not just for your class 10th board exams but also for your 12th, because as you go to your 11th and 12th standard, you are again going to learn about a lot of these topics in little more detail. So pay attention and understand the concepts like never before. So are we all ready to get started? Let's get started. Now, in order to understand the process of sexual reproduction, first of all, we should be clear with the structure of a flower. What are the different parts of a flower and what are their functions? So let us look at the structure of a flower. So we have considered here a very basic diagram of any flower. So any flower will have more or less the same structures, just that their appearance will be little different from each other. So let us look at the different parts which together constitute the flower. First is the stalk. So what is the stalk? This tube-like structure which actually holds the flower. So this is the stalk of the flower. So what is its purpose? Its purpose is to hold the flower. It acts as the base for the flower. Next is thalamus. Now just towards the end of the stalk, at the top of the stalk, you see a swollen structure, right? This swollen structure is the thalamus. So it is the swollen upper portion of the stalk. So what does the thalamus do? Now since the thalamus is a swollen portion, so the flower, the entire structure of the flower can properly sit over this thalamus. Next, petals. What are petals? These are the colored parts of the flower. So these are petals. So they come in a variety of colors depending upon the flower. For example, you have so many different colors for a rose. You have red, orange, yellow, so many different colors actually. So these are the colored parts of the flower, and this colored part actually is to attract insects. So due to looking at the fancy colors, the insects get attracted towards the flower. Now why the flower wants insect to come towards it? We will study that as we go ahead with the slides. So these petals also acts as a protective organ because it protects the reproductive organs which are present inside. Now reproductive organs, the actual organs are present inside the flower. So the petals actually act as a covering to those reproductive organs. Next is sepals. What are sepals? Sepals are these green colored structures. You would have seen that just below the petals, outside the petals in fact, you have a smaller wall which are smaller in size and generally green in colors. These are known as sepals. Their primary function is to protect the flower when it is a bud. So this flower grows from a bud, right? So you would have seen that when the flower is a bud, somewhat like this is how a bud looks, right? So you would have seen that these sepals actually cover the flower like this from outside. If you have never observed it, please try to observe. You will see that the entire bud is completely protected with the help of these sepals. So they ensure protection to the bud. Next is stamens. So stamen is the male reproductive organ. So that is our main concern here. So where are the stamens located? So these structures are the stamens. So you see a green rod-like structure with a yellow head. So there are so many such structures. These are stamens. So these structures. So this entire structure is stamen, and this is the male reproductive organ. That means this structure actually produces the male sex cells or the male gametes. What are the male gametes in a flower? Male gametes are the pollen grains. That means these stamens produces pollen grains. Now we will see how we will study about the structure of the stamen in detail in the next slide, and then we will see how are pollen grains produced. And the last part is the carpel, that is the female reproductive organ. So that means this part is going to produce the female sex cell. So here, which is the carpel? This entire portion is the carpel. So you see, this is a glass-like structure and this is the carpel. So this structure, so inside carpel also there are different parts. So we will study that in the next slide. And what are the female gametes known as in a plant? It is known as ovum or egg. The plural of ovum is ova. So the male gametes are known as pollen grains and the female gametes are ovum or egg in a plant. So now we are aware of the different structure of the flower. Let us try to study the male and the female reproductive organ in little more detail. So this was my flower. Let us talk about the structure of stamen. Now if we look at the structure of a stamen closely, this is how they look like. So the stamen itself will have a stalk like this. This is known as the stalk of the stamen. And this part, this yellow colored part is known as anther. So this yellow colored part is called anther and this green colored part is called stalk of the stamen. This is the stalk of the flower and this is the stalk of the stamen. Now when you look it very closely from the back side, this is how it looks. These are the two lobes of the anther. So the anther actually consists of, in this picture you just see it as a small yellow structure. But when you see it closely, you see that actually there are two lobes of anther. It is like two different lobes and they are connected by this pink color structure. This pink structure is known as connective. So this connective actually connects the two lobes of anther. So these yellow colored structures are the two lobes of anther. This pink structure is the connective and this green structure is the stalk. So this is how it looks like when you look it from back. So this is the dorsal view of the stamen. When you look it from front, this is how it looks like. These are the two lobes. From front it will look somewhat like this. Now if you look at the cross section, that means if you take this anther and if you cut this anther, this yellow colored structure from between. So this is how the cross section looks like. It has 4 lobes and these lobes are known as pollen sacs. So we have these 4 lobes and these lobes are known as pollen sacs. So these lobes actually contain the pollen grains. So the pollen grains are present inside the pollen sacs. So now you understand how well protected are the male gametes inside the flower. So inside the flower, first you have the sepals, that is the green colored structure. Now while studying this slide, in case you have a flower in your garden, please take that flower and observe these parts. That will be more interesting for you. So if you look at the flower, the first protection is by these sepals, these green colored structure. Then you have the petals, the entire world of petals. Inside the petals, you have these kind of structures where you have small yellow structures at the top. Even inside this yellow structure, you have 4 lobes. And inside those lobes, you have the pollen grains. So these yellow colored structures are very easily visible in a flower. In case you have a China rose plant in your house, you can observe things very clearly there. There it is very easily noticeable. So this is how the stamen looks like and this is where the male gametes are present in a flower. Now let us talk about the female reproductive organ, that is the carpel. So when we look at the structure of the carpel, so only the carpel we have taken out of this plant. So this carpel actually consists of 3 parts, that is style, stigma and ovary. These are the 3 important parts of a carpel. So which are these parts? So this upper portion is the stigma. This tube-like structure is style. So what does style do? Style connects the stigma with the ovary and this round structure is ovary. So ovary is the basal swollen part of the carpel. Stigma is the topmost part. So what is the purpose of stigma? Stigma receives pollen grain. Now, we know that for sexual reproduction, what has to happen? Fusion between the male gamete and the female gamete has to take place. Now, which is my male gamete here? Male gamete is pollen grains. What is my female gamete here? Female gamete is egg. So that means there has to be fusion between the pollen grain and the egg. So that means the pollen grain has to come inside this female structure in order to fuse with the egg. So stigma is that part which actually receives the pollen grain from the male part of the flower. So stigma, what is the function of stigma? Receives pollen grains. What is the function of style? It actually connects stigma with the ovary. So now style will actually carry the pollen grains through the style. Since style is there, it will connect the stigma with the ovary. Ovary is the basal swollen part. Now inside the ovary, you have another small round structure, and that is known as ovule. Now inside the ovary, there are many ovules, and inside each ovule, there is one female gamete which is known as ovum. So inside the ovule, you have one female gamete which is called ovum. Right? So now you know where the male gametes are present, inside the anther. So if you look at this flower, so the male gametes are present somewhere inside this yellow colored structure. And where is the female gamete present? It is present somewhere inside this ovule. So now in order for sexual reproduction to take place, this male gamete should fuse with this female gamete. So that means these pollen grains should reach the stigma, and from there it should be able to reach this ovum. And then the fusion takes place and the reproduction will actually take place. So now we will see what are the different steps which are involved in sexual reproduction in plants. The following steps together constitute complete sexual reproduction in plants: pollination, fertilization, seed formation, and germination. So these 4 steps taken together complete the entire reproduction cycle in plants. So now we will discuss about each of these steps in detail one by one. So we will start with pollination. So let us see what is pollination. The word pollination looks like has been derived from the word pollen, right? It looks similar to pollen pollination, something like that. So what is pollination? It is transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now for sexual reproduction to happen, the pollen grains should meet the egg, right? Now in order for the pollen grain to meet the egg, the pollen grain has to go to the female reproductive part. That is, pollen grains will have to reach the carpel. So which part of the carpel pollen grain will reach? Stigma, right? So the pollen grains are present in the anther. So they have to move from anther to stigma. So this transfer of pollen grains is known as pollination. And that is the first step of sexual reproduction. Because first of all, the pollen grains will have to reach the female reproductive part. Now, there are 2 things that can happen. One possibility is that the pollen grains will move from anther to the stigma. That means from here to here of the same plant. This is the stigma and this is the anther. So this is anther and this is stigma. So one possibility is pollen grain will move from anther to stigma of the same flower. So that is known as self-pollination. Now another possibility is pollen grain will move from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. That is known as cross-pollination. So same pollination means same flower and cross-pollination means different flower. Clear? So now when I say self-pollination, this self-pollination is possible only for bisexual flowers. It is possible for bisexual flowers, because bisexual flowers are the ones where we have both the male part and the female part in the same flower. So anther and stigma will be present in the same flower. But if it is unisexual flower, in that case you will not have both anther and stigma in the same flower. So this self-pollination occurs mostly in bisexual flowers, whereas the cross-pollination occurs both in unisexual as well as bisexual flowers. So in unisexual flowers, since either anther or stigma will be there, so obviously there has to be cross-pollination. Now in some bisexual flowers, sometimes it might happen that the anther and the stigma both did not get matured at the same time. In that case, anther from this flower will get carried to, so the pollen grain from anther of this flower will get carried to the stigma of another flower. So that means we can say that cross-pollination is possible both in unisexual flowers as well as bisexual flowers. But when I talk about self-pollination, that is possible only for bisexual flowers. Clear? Okay. So now the question is, how will the pollen grains get transferred? So who will carry these pollen grains? So for that, we have some special agents whose job is only to carry the pollen grains. So this transfer of pollen grains occur with the help of pollinating agents. So those objects which carry the pollen grains from the anther to stigma are known as pollinating agents. Now examples of pollinating agents are wind, water, insects, birds. So you would have, now you can understand why bees get attracted towards the flower. Now looking at the colorful petals of the flowers, bees get attracted. Now when bees reach the flower, what do? They carry the pollen grain from that flower and they take it to the stigma of some another flower or to the same flower. Right? So not only bees, there are several other insects which you would have seen that keep hovering around the flowers. Also when there is a wind blowing, so the pollen grains might get shifted from the anther to stigma by wind or by water, by insects or birds. So these are some of the pollinating agents. Right? So this is how the pollen grains will reach the female reproductive part of the flower. So now the pollen grains have reached the stigma. Now the question is, what is the next step? The next step is fertilization. When I say fertilization, I mean the process where the actual fusion is going to take place. That means the pollen grains will combine with the ovum in this step. So how will it combine? So now the pollen grains are in the stigma. So the pollen grains will have to travel from stigma to the ovule, because the egg is present, egg or the ovum is present inside the ovule and the ovule is present inside the ovary. So the fusion of pollen and egg is called fertilization. So in this step we will see how this fusion actually takes place. So here I have shown the diagram of only the carpel. So here this is the stigma, this is the style, and this is the ovary. Inside the ovary, this is the ovule. And inside the ovule, we have the female germ cell. So this cell is the female germ cell. And where is the pollen grain? Pollen grain is on the stigma. So the pollen grain is here and the female germ cell is here. So this pollen grain will have to fuse with the female germ cell. So how will it reach there? Now each of this pollen grain contains two male gametes. Now as I said, these pollen grains, actually these are small grains. Inside those grains are present the male gametes. Now this pollen grain will actually form a pollen tube. So you see there is a tube-like structure which is passing through the style. This is the style. And this orange colored tube is the pollen tube. So this pollen tube will carry it to the ovule. Right? So now the pollen grain, the germ cell, the male germ cell or the male gamete which is present inside the pollen grain will travel through this pollen tube and it will reach the ovary. It will not only the ovary but it will reach the ovule and then here it will reach. So once the male germ cell reaches here, the female germ cell is already there. So the male germ cell and the female germ cell will fuse together and this fusion will give rise to a zygote. What is zygote? Zygote is a single-celled organism which is formed by the fusion of the male cell and the female cell. So they will fuse together to form a zygote which will consist of one cell. Now just now I told you that the pollen grain consists of two male gametes. So this is what I talked about, one male gamete. So one male gamete will fuse with the egg to form zygote. What happens to the other male gamete? Now the other male gamete will also come here and it will fuse with the secondary nuclei. Here you see some other nuclei. So it will fuse with these secondary nuclei and it will form endosperm. What is endosperm now? Endosperm is nothing but the food storage of the zygote. Now this zygote needs food also for its survival, right? So that is provided by the endosperm. So we will discuss that later. So for now you should know that fertilization means the male germ cell will fuse with the egg and it will result in the formation of zygote. So something like this will be formed. So where is the, now you see the difference here? So in this case, so here you see this is the zygote and this is the endosperm. So the zygote is formed by the fusion of one male germ cell and the egg cell, and endosperm is formed by fusion of the other male germ cell and the secondary nuclei, right? So now you have inside one zygote and the other endosperm. So this is the fertilization. So that means the first step was pollination, where the pollen grain reaches the female reproductive part, that is the pollen grain reaches the stigma. The second step is fertilization, where the male germ cell present inside the pollen grain will reach till the ovary and it will fuse with the egg cell to form the zygote. Now the third step is seed formation. Now how will a seed be formed? Because seed is something which we are all aware of. You would have heard that if you grow a plant in your house, sometimes you buy seeds from the market. So when you put the seed under the soil, a new plant comes out of that seed, right? So that means the seed has the capability to give rise to a new plant. So how is that seed formed? So that seed is the result of sexual reproduction in plants. So zygote is formed, we are clear till that. Now we will see how seed will be formed after the zygote formation. Now the zygote will divide repeatedly to form embryo. So zygote was single celled. There was only one cell in zygote. But this one cell will divide repeatedly. So cell divisions will occur. As a result, many cells will be formed. And this multi-celled organism is called embryo. So the zygote will turn into an embryo, right? Now this embryo plus the endosperm, which I talked about in the previous slide, they together form the seed. So here we told this was the zygote, and this was the endosperm, right? So this zygote will now get converted into the embryo. So this was my zygote and this was the endosperm, right? So this zygote will undergo repeated division and it will become embryo. So this embryo and this endosperm together will form the seed. So this is the embryo. This green colored structure is embryo. So the zygote, which was a small structure here, will undergo many divisions and it will form a multi-celled embryo. And this embryo plus the endosperm, here you see the yellow colored structure. So the embryo plus endosperm will together form the seed. Now ovule develops a thick coat and forms seed. So what is ovule? Here also ovule was nothing but zygote plus, and it was containing the zygote and the endosperm. So here the ovule is containing the embryo and the endosperm. So this becomes the ovule becomes the seed. And what happens to the ovary? The ovary ripens to become the fruit. So the ovule now turns into a seed. So ovule, what was it? It was nothing but a circular structure inside which was present the zygote. So now that zygote converted into embryo by repeated division. So now what do you have inside the ovule? We have an embryo and the endosperm, right? So this embryo and endosperm is the seed. So ovule now becomes the seed. So just for the protection of the seed, there is a seed coat. So this seed coat, it is a tough covering which ensures protection to the seed. So it keeps the seed well protected inside. And the ovary, that is this whole structure, this whole spherical swollen structure, this ripens into a fruit. So this becomes a fruit. So now you can imagine this structure very similar to any fruit which we eat. For example, you would have seen apple. So apple is the fruit. Now inside the apple you would have seen small seeds, right? So that is how it is. So that apple is basically formed, the fruit which you see, which we actually eat. That is nothing, that was initially the ovary. So even if you look at that plant, there would have been some flowers. So the flowers would have undergone this kind of reproduction, as a result of which the seed and the fruit is formed. Now after the fruit is consumed, the seed is left behind, and that seed is capable of reproduction. It is capable of giving rise to a new plant. So this is how a seed looks like. So if you only look at the structure of a seed, it will look somewhat like this. Now if you try to understand what is there inside a seed that it is capable of giving rise to a new plant. Now if you see the internal structure of a seed, you will see that the seed has a plumule, a radicle and cotyledon. Now what are these? Plumule is nothing but a tiny shoot. Plumule is a tiny shoot. So this is the plumule, the upper part. Now as these seed, when you put this seed under the soil, put some water, what happens? It starts getting minerals. So this tiny shoot starts rising high, starts growing. Similarly, this radicle is nothing but a tiny root. So when it gets minerals and all other nutrients, it starts growing like roots. What are the cotyledons? Cotyledons are nothing but the organs which store food, because for any living organism to grow, it needs energy, and energy comes from food. So even this seed, in order to grow, it needs some food. So the food comes from cotyledons. Now the seed can have one cotyledon, it can also have two cotyledons. We have already spoken about monocots and dicots, right? So monocots are those plants whose seeds have one cotyledon. Dicots are those plants whose seeds have two cotyledons. In case you want to know more detail, please refer to Diversity in Living Organisms of class 9th. Okay, so here you understand how a seed is formed. So you see, everything is happening stepwise, one after another. First, pollination. So the pollen grains will reach the stigma. Second is fertilization. So pollen grain will travel from stigma to the ovary. It will fuse with the egg and a zygote will be formed. Third step is zygote will divide repeatedly and it will form an embryo. So the ovule, which is containing the embryo, will become the seed, and the ovary will become the fruit. So now this seed is capable of giving rise to a new plant. Why? Because the seed's internal structure consists of a tiny shoot called plumule and a tiny root called radicle, and its food storage is stored in leaf-like structures called cotyledons. Clear? So now the question is, when will the seed become active? That means when will the seed give rise to a new plant under favorable conditions? So what happens under unfavorable conditions? So the seed will remain dormant during the unfavorable condition. That means the seed will not be active. It will just remain like this. It will not give rise to a new plant. Now the question is, what happens in favorable condition? So we all know that it will give rise to a new plant. So that is going to be the last step. That is germination. That means the growth of a plant from a seed is known as germination. It is the development of a seedling from a seed. Seedling is a very, very tiny plant. So this is how germination will happen. This is the seed. This is the internal structure of the seed. Now, when it is put under favorable conditions, you know what is favorable condition? That means, example, you put the soil under the soil, give it some water. So now the conditions are favorable for the growth of the seed. So a small seedling will arise. So here you see, this is the small root, this is a small shoot, and gradually this will give rise to a bigger plant. So this radicle will give rise to bigger roots and it will grow as the plant grows. So again, when the plant grows, the plant will bear buds, it will bear flowers. So when it will have flowers, the flowers will again undergo sexual reproduction. So again, zygote will be formed, embryo will be formed, and again the entire process will keep on continuing. So this is all about the sexual reproduction in plants. So the reproductive part in a plant is flower. So if there is no flower, there will be no sexual reproduction, right? So this was all about sexual reproduction in plants. So let us have a quick overview. Let us have a quick overview of the entire cycle. So which was the reproductive part of a plant? It was the flower. So it all started with the flower. So inside the flower we have the male gametes, that is pollen grains, and the female gamete, that is the egg. So what happens at the first stage of reproduction? Pollination. So in pollination, what will happen? The male gametes, that is the pollen grains, will be transferred to the female part of the flower, that is to the stigma. So now the pollen grains are in the female part. What was the next step? Next step was fertilization. So in this step, the pollen grains will actually reach the ovary of the flower and it will fuse with the egg, and as a result, zygote will be formed. So now once the zygote is formed, after that what happens? The zygote will divide repeatedly and it will become an embryo. So now once the embryo is formed, the ovule will convert itself into a seed. So seed formation will take place. Right? Now once the seed is formed, the seed will remain inactive during the unfavorable conditions, but when favorable conditions are present, the seed will develop into a seedling and the seedling will develop into a bigger plant. So the next step would be germination, that is formation of seedling from the seed. Now once a seedling is formed, again that seedling will grow and it will form a bigger plant. So when a plant grows, again the plant will have flower. So when it has flowers, again it will have the male and female gametes. Again pollination will happen, again fertilization, seed formation, germination, and so on. So this cycle will keep on continuing in this fashion. Right? And that is how sexual reproduction also will keep happening in plants.
I hope you found this entire series on reproduction or how do organisms reproduce useful. If you have a feedback to share, do let us know in the comment section. If you really like the video, you should share it with your friends so that they can enjoy the video too. I will see you all very soon with a new video with a new topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.